Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Coin and Geek podcast. This is one of your hosts, Elliot Hillis. Today is July 1st. We made it past June, the wonderful month of June, and all the wonderful pride that it entails. And we are now into officially the second half of our year, coming upon the hottest days of the summer here in Arizona. And I am joined, as always, by my friend and co-host, Mr. Daniel Schultz. Daniel, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm pretty good. Yeah. I was going to say tired, but I don't feel tired at the moment.
Yeah.
So I probably will in about 30 minutes. I'll have expended all my energy for the day. And
what time did you get up this morning?
Like 5:30.
Yeah. So I started. Go ahead.
With the sun coming up early, it's like, all right, time to get up. And then I'm like, wait, it's got to be 7 by now. No, 5:30.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. I started a new job recently, and in order to get to work, it's an hour drive. And so I've been getting up at like 4:30 every morning, which is horrible. But so today was like the first day where I felt like I got like a full night's sleep, and I still woke up at 6 and I was like exhausted. But yeah, like the sun's up, and we're trying to block out the sun and all that. I'm just like, I might as well just get up and play a few video games before my wife.
That's right. That's right. Before responsibilities take over.
Yes, exactly. So speaking of that, I'm excited about today's topic. Coin and Geek, for those of you guys who are new. I mean, we do talk about things geeky in the sense of like comic books and movies, but a lot of our focus tends to come back to gaming, as that's the thing that I'm most passionate about and have the most familiarity with. Daniel is also a gamer, but has more familiarity with comics and things. So this episode is going to be more gaming centric. And last time we talked about some of the expos that were going on. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, actually. So let me back up. Speaking of games, last time you said you were still playing, what is it, Crusaders 3? Is that the right
Crusader
name?
Kings. Yeah, Crusader Kings 3. Yeah.
Are you still playing that, or what else are you doing?
I play it off and on, so I don't think I've played it since last we spoke.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I've been playing Football Manager, which is
I
regularly play. But I did play some Xbox.
Ooh.
I actually played some Xbox recently. I started playing through Blue Dragon, which was on the original Xbox 360.
Yeah.
And I started playing through that with my son, and he really enjoys it. I mean, it's a Kira Toriyama art style, Nobuo Uematsu music, and Hironobu Sakaguchi. There, I got them all. The creator of Final Fantasy, coming together to make the first video game they've made since the original, Dragon Quest had some of these guys on it, or Chrono Trigger,
Yeah.
And it's a fun game. I have not beaten it, but I have played through a considerable amount of it before. But it was fun. It's been fun to start playing that with him and kind of introduce him to some games more than Tigger's Honey Hunt, which he likes to play on for the original PlayStation.
So you're doing something RPG light, kind of in that way.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's cool. I never played that game, even though I didn't have an Xbox, or I missed out on it. But I think, those names, for anybody that is familiar with Final Fantasy or just gaming in general, those are all like, Hall of Famers in terms of their influence. Speaking of Final Fantasy, that's what I'm playing mostly these days, is Final Fantasy 16. And it's interesting. We'll do another show when I've beaten it. I want to do at least one show with my buddy John Marcus, who's also playing the game, to do kind of like a spoiler cast thing. But then I'll talk about, my feelings about the game and everything on our normal show. I really, really like it. But it's interesting, those names you threw out and where Final Fantasy kind of started, and maybe that like more lighthearted Final Fantasy. And Final Fantasy's not always been lighthearted, but I think you could argue it may start it out that way, or there's been moments of that, and into like what is a very mature and dark story, and like yeah, it's just interesting to see the two sides of the spectrum. But I'm enjoying it. It's not a perfect game. Not that there is such a thing. There are things that I want to talk about from a critical angle. But in terms of like what I want from a Final Fantasy, in terms of like story and narrative and characters and world building, that stuff has been amazing. So I'm really happy with that. And then I do play some Street Fighter 6 still on the side and torture myself, because Street Fighters, I love fighting games, but I'm kind of like I've kind of just one of those dudes that's like the fighting game whole genre has passed me in terms of like my ability to keep up and be good at it. But there's enough players in Street Fighter 6, and they've done a good enough job matchmaking to where I feel like I can get in with like competition that's mine, like right at my level, and that makes it a lot of fun. So
That is interesting. I haven't thought about, I guess, what I would consider like traditional competitive games like that, and what matchmaking would be like today in the world of Overwatch or Fortnite or Rocket League, which is scaling to your level
yeah,
and allowing you to compete against the people that hypothetically you should be able to beat them or
yeah.
be competitive, and then you move up as your. Is that the kind of matchmaking they have now, or is it maybe in between what it used to be and that?
That's a great question. So I will say that in my experience, this is some of the best matchmaking I've ever fallen upon, and they kind of do it. I don't know if this is a clever way or not, but okay. So let me just compare it to the last fighting game that I tried to play online, which was Dragon Ball Fighters, which is another great game by Arc System Works. But you enter that game, and I could be wrong. They may have fixed it, or my memory could be bad. But it's hard to know what level of player you're playing against. It's not real clear. So I could be fighting against someone that's just like, this guy's, trying to get on the Evo circuit, or I can be playing somebody that just has never played before.
Right.
Now, I consider myself like kind of okay. If I pick up a fighting game, I generally know what I'm doing. I know like the quarter circle motions, those kind of standard things. But I always felt like, I think I played 20 matches in a row of Dragon Ball Fighters, and I didn't win a single one. Like not a single one. And I played through the whole game on hard. Like I could beat the computer. And so it's like, this feels like two different games. Like whatever I'm learning in the main game is not ultimately helping me in competition because I keep getting my butt kicked. So I got frustrated and I finally quit. Street Fighter 6, one, they give you tons of training modes, and they're actually really good about teaching you how to play the game, and even some of the granular details about like what frame data means and like, hey, this is like a good startup. But then to get to your question about the matchmaking, one, you can play a ton of things in casual matches, which is a great way to kind of hone your skill, and that doesn't count towards your rank at all. And in there you can kind of fall anywhere between like beginners and maybe somebody higher up on the scale. But the way they have it laid out is like, basically, like if you're a beginner, you're like in the iron class, and then as you move up, you can get like 5 stars within that class, and then you move up to the next tier, which is something like, I think it's gold or silver, and then you get 5 stars, then you move on to that. So theoretically you can be like, okay, well, if I'm fighting if I'm a 2-star iron and I'm fighting a 4-star iron, we're kind of in that same thing where it's like, it's possible that I could beat this person and rank up, or they may just, they may have just had a couple of bad fights and rank down. So they place you after fighting like 10 matches. So you do like a placement series, and this is true for every single character. So if I'm fighting with Ken and I'm trying to rank, you'll fight 9 or 10 matches, and then they'll place you accordingly and be like, oh, okay, well, based upon your skills and whatever algorithm they have, like, we think you're right here, and you have a chance to rank up and rank down. So I really like that. There's been a couple guys that I've come across that have been just skill wise above me, and sometimes it's just like a bad matchup, like maybe Ken isn't a good matchup for Zangief or something, or vice versa. So I really feel like the game in that way is really, really fair. And so I love it. I mean, it's one of those things that's just like, I very rarely feel like I'm going up against somebody that is way outside of my skill level. And so however they figured it out, that keeps guys like me, who are probably more on the casual side, but want to like get better at the game and kind of are interested in seeing like how good can I get, that keeps me coming back. So yeah, they did a good job with that.
That's good. It's been a long time since I have purchased a new fighting game.
Yeah.
And I did pick up Killer Instinct on the Xbox One, and I've played it
Yeah.
a couple times just for the nostalgia
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
But fighting games to me were best played in the arcade, standing next to the person, whether it was your buddy or somebody random that you were playing in the arcade that you didn't know. And it has never been as fun to me to play a fighting game at home as it was to play in the arcade.
Yeah, they're different experiences. I think if you're somebody that isn't into fighting games, like the arcade experience is the one that's going to be like the peak. But I think if you're somebody like me who's kind of maybe wanting to get more, just develop their skills and cares about that stuff and wants to like explore the deeper mechanics of the game, that it's a different kind of focus. You could call it grinding or whatever, but it's less about that. The cool thing about Street Fighter 6 is that they really do a great job, I think, of giving something for everybody. They have a specific mode. It's called what is it called? Like Battle Hub. And it's basically like a virtual arcade. So you have like an avatar that you create, and it's literally like you walk in and it's just a big hub of a bunch of players with their avatars, and there's actual literal arcade machines where you can go around and somebody can be playing and you can sit down and challenge them, or you can gather around and you can spectate. And they even have other arcade machines where it's like, hey, I'm going to go over here and play Final Fight or like Street Fighter 2, and you can play that. So obviously it's not the same thing as being in person, but it does kind of like, it shows you that Japan like acknowledges its roots. And I think there's something kind of like nostalgic and fun about that particular mode that they included.
Speaking of Japan and nostalgia, I think we could transition into another topic. But before we use that brilliant segue, just talking about fighting games, this book series, Will White, his Cradle series, the first book of which is right there, unsold. I cannot recommend highly enough. The series is complete.
Okay.
It does not disappoint. And it is like, if you are a fan of fighting games or of RPGs, of like the sort of progression of someone gaining skills and getting better at fighting.
Yeah.
Like, that book series is for you. So that's a recommendation to anybody out there looking for a book series to get.
Is it a book or is it like a comic book?
It is a book. It is a novel series. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, speaking of this, I've been kind of teasing this for the last two shows. Daniel's really wanted to talk about Konami, and so I'll kind of. I spoke a little bit, I think, on one of these last shows about Capcom and kind of like their rise back to prominence after being given the name Crapcom for a while, which you could say was maybe the period of the PS3 to the PS4 a little bit. But in the last 5 years, they've really come back strong with actually just kind of going back to their roots. They're like, what are our biggest franchises? Resident Evil, Street Fighter, Devil May Cry. And they've gone back and really fine-tuned those. And now they're like, I forgot, but they posted like a massive profit. So Capcom has kind of like worked their way back. Konami, I'm going to let Daniel take this over, but Konami has been one of these companies that basically since like Metal Gear Solid 4 and a little bit of Metal Gear Solid 5, but there was a lot of drama that happened around there. They kind of just took themselves completely out of the game. Yeah. And like Konami is responsible for Castlevania, Metal Gear Solid, and several others like Contra, a bunch of games that you remember.
Contra,
yeah, Silent Hill, exactly. So the fact that they stepped away from doing games basically altogether and focused on their other properties they have, because Konami is like a way bigger company than just a video game maker. In Japan, they've got like gyms and like places you can eat that are Konami oriented, but they now just started to kind of dip their toes back into the water. And I want to pass it on to Daniel and just kind of see, you've been sitting on this kind of thought for a while. So
it's funny because we did talk about Capcom last time. And I think to me, Capcom, Konami, and Namco Bandai, like they're kind of the quintessential Japanese video game companies, where they had a bunch of different franchises. They were popular for a long time. And then with Konami, they just gave up like a long time ago. Like pretty much anything they've made, they've developed, they basically feel stopped really pushing after the PlayStation 2 era. And I played Metal Gear Solid 4. I didn't hate the game. I actually liked it better than Metal Gear Solid 3. But what other, there was no other games basically that they put out after the PlayStation 2 era that had any impact, were any good. And then the only games they were putting out were Metal Gear Solid games, which the story had been told. Snake's story had been told. It was over. And instead of letting it go and coming up with something new, they knew, well, if we want to put out anything, we have to put out our biggest franchise. And it's like, well, you used to have more than one huge franchises. Instead, they let Castlevania die a death 2 generations before that, right? Like on the original PlayStation, you had what is
they tried to make the Lord of Shadows, which was like a 3D.
Yeah, well, I'll get to it. God of War ripoff garbage, but they made Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and it was and is the best, still is the best game of that style, that Metroidvania style game. The games that are coming out nowadays, Bloodstained, for instance, they are spiritual successors, not to Castlevania, not just to Castlevania, but specifically Symphony of the Night. People want that game. They love that game. I do. It's one of my favorite games. It's in my top 5. It's one of those games that I will go and play over and over and over again. The art style of that, of that era on the original PlayStation, where you didn't have the limited 3D, but you're still doing a side-scrolling platformer. It just works so well. It's so brilliant. And really, since that period, game companies went into 3D, and that just killed Castlevania, because I don't know what company makes God of War other than Sony. I don't know what the internal.
It's just Sony Santa Monica.
Yeah. So Sony makes God of War for the PlayStation 3, and it is so much better than what a 3D Castlevania game had been, and different, that instead of going with what had worked and making just a brilliant game, they chased the trends, and then nobody cared about Castlevania. Now, I know that there's the Nintendo DS successors to Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I've played them. They are good. But there's a difference between a handheld game from that generation and a console game. There is something about playing a game with a controller on the couch on a big screen that just cannot be recaptured in those handhelds. It's just like I wouldn't necessarily want to play Pokemon on the Xbox, but I would want to play Pokemon on a handheld. There's games that are meant for these things. And I feel like Konami is to me the epitome of what video games have become in so many ways. Cashing in on one big thing, trying to recreate what was lightning in a bottle. The original Metal Gear Solid, one of my favorite games. I like Metal Gear Solid 2, 3. I understand why other people like it. The expansion of the gameplay, I did not care for. The different, having to like kill snakes and eat and all this other stuff. I thought just detracted from the stealth aspects of the game, and that is what it is. But I understand why people like it. And they kept advancing, but advancing away from what made them popular, what made them a good company, what made their video games good. And then all the stuff with Hideo Kojima and the driving him out of the company, wanting him to continue to tell a story that he'd already told, wanting him to remake these classic games. And then you get to this point where like Metal Gear Solid 4 is basically like watching a movie. Like there's so little gameplay in that compared to how many cutscenes are in it, like compared to a normal game. And there were so many issues happening to it that they just kind of let everything languish. And I feel like that's what we've seen, especially in this last console generation on the Xbox side, but other places as well, is the complacency. And it kind of goes into the acquisitions that we want to talk about. But before we do that, let's hear your thoughts on Konami.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with a lot of what you said. Now, just on the topic of Metal Gear, I love. So, Metal Gear is probably one of my favorite franchises historically. They haven't been relevant to me at least the last 5 years, probably more like the last 10. Metal Gear Solid 5 is the only Metal Gear game I never finished. I just kind of stopped, even though that game got really good reviews and they like the gameplay aspect is good. But I actually missed a lot of the story. I thought the story kind of went off the rails, which probably to your point started really with Metal Gear Solid 4, which was just kind of this big convoluted mess. So I've always been kind of bitter about the Metal Gear, and Kojima thing that happened. Konami also is the owner of one of my favorite RPG series, Suikoden. So seeing Konami kind of just step back and out of the picture, or seeing like them trying to put out their own Metal Gear game, which is like Metal Gear Survive or something, and it was like a zombie game, and it just from everything about it, you're like, dude, like who asked? Nobody asked for this. Like, and this kind of sums up a lot of what I feel. This is getting in the bigger picture. There's a time where I just feel like so much of Japan and Japanese gaming like had no idea what I feel like they had no idea what they were doing. Like, what do they think that we want? And they seem to be off the mark a lot. And I could talk about Square Enix and how that's been similar, but
that does bring up an interesting point. And I think it's something that is true about Japanese culture in general. Is Japan is sort of at its best when it's not worrying about the sensibilities of other countries or the storytelling games of other countries. And when they are trying to cater to other markets, they tend to do worse a lot of the time.
Well, I mean, this can get into a whole huge discussion, which I'm happy to go there for a little bit, but the Konami thing is really, I think, to your point, like the epitome of maybe what was wrong with Japanese gaming for a certain period of time, for sure, in that they never seemed to really know how to be like beyond Metal Gear. They really didn't know or listen to like what did audiences want. The Symphony of the Night thing is a perfect example. Like they didn't even try to make like a next gen 2D. And the PS4 would have been a great time to do it, because that's when like indie developers and smaller studios were really given like the thumbs up, like let's go, let's do this. So now we have like Kickstarter, which is a whole other thing, and we're starting to see Bloodstained and all that, which is fine, it's great. But yeah, Konami just seemed to like, whereas Capcom and I would argue Square Enix over the last maybe 3-4 years, 5 years, really kind of regrouped and said, okay, let's figure out what makes us special, and let's make what we're known for really good. Like I would say that Capcom's done that with Resident Evil and with Street Fighter. And I say that beyond the Resident Evil remakes, like Resident Evil 7 was a massive departure from any of the other Resident Evils going to first person, and Resident Evil 8 the same, but it's still very Resident Evil. And those games are really good. They're really good. And there's just more of a confidence, I think, with those companies. And Konami is now coming back and be like, oh, wait, we missed out. So speaking of Konami, there's some of the original Suikoden developers started a Kickstarter for something called Ayuden Chronicles, which is basically like the Suikoden follow-up I've always wanted since the second one. And so that game became like one of the biggest Kickstarter, like it was like funded like super fast. And so I think Konami was like, wait a minute, we're leaving money on the table here. Yeah. So we're going to come back and we're going to release Suikoden. We're going to do some upgrades. And I'm fine with that. Like, I love those games and I want more access to them. And they're not changing the style of it so completely where I feel like I'm looking at something totally different. So I'm okay with that. And now Konami is also trying to come back with Silent Hill, and they're coming back with Silent Hill 2 remake, because out of all the Silent Hill games, usually, generally speaking, Silent Hill 2 is the one that's most thought of in a positive light. But they're not only doing Silent Hill, they're doing like 5 other spinoffs of Silent Hill. So for me, I'm really, and I know like you don't like remakes. I know that's like not your thing, but I am on the opposite side. I think as long as they're good and they are fun and they still kind of create a sense of like whatever they're trying to convey, I'm okay with it. And Silent Hill 2 is a PS2 game. Like, I would be totally fine with that being upgraded so long as it's good. But Konami as a company, I think I don't trust them. You know, they have like a lot of that, like, you got to prove it to me that you're in this. So we'll see how some of these games turn out. And interestingly enough, there's some controversy with Konami as to like, okay, what teams inside Konami are in charge of these? And I don't necessarily know that they're their top tier. So I don't know if Konami is just like trying to feel this out, but based upon their history, I don't know.
No, yeah, it does. They've been so lackluster for so long that it doesn't really look like it. To me, like, I don't have any faith that they're going to be putting out, Silent Hill 4 or 5 that's like really good, and everybody's like, wow, this is what the I guess it'd be 5, but what the horror genre should have become. Like, wow, this is great. Can you believe that they've taken what was good about Silent Hill and made it into a great game? It's like, no, I have very little doubt that that's going to happen.
Well, on that note, like, that was like the final nail in the coffin for Konami, was when Kojima was working on Silent Hills, like known as PT, the demo that, like, honestly, that demo is scarier than any game I've ever played. Like, and when they revealed that this is the next Silent Hill, like, and I think that directly influenced Resident Evil going to first person, because like what they accomplished in that demo was nothing short of brilliant. And I'm like, dude, this is crazy. And like, this is so cool and so creepy and so well done. But then they're like, no, we'll just abandon it. We'll let Kojima go. So they had their opportunity, and then they blew it.
Well, and that's the thing is this is where something like Silent Hill, I'm not completely against all remakes. And most of the time, I think we'd be better off making something new. But some of the technological advancement could actually make a horror game something that it could enhance it. Remember when we first started down our journey of making a video game content together, one of the first things we ever did was use the PlayStation VR.
Yeah.
And I played the demo with you were there, as well as Joy. And I played the demo for whatever Resident Evil game was. And it was legitimately horrifying. Like, you are in a room. Somebody might go back and play this. I don't want to tell them, but like, it is legitimately scary. And I could see where there's no way I could play that whole game in first person. Like, I just would not enjoy that experience.
Yeah.
But for people that like that, and the idea of actually being surprised by an event, or horrified by something, or shocked and startled, and all of those things that we would want a video game like that to be. It's like we now are in a technological place where those things they can be done very well, like the holodeck on Star Trek, essentially. Like you're getting to that point, but nobody used it well enough except for in like little demos, or like here's a game over here, and then over here it's like, yeah, this is sort of in 3D, but it doesn't really matter. I think as a whole, the video game company kind of dropped the ball on VR, where they should have went more towards the strengths of it, like horror, and they, I don't know what shifting sands or what, but
yeah,
everybody kind of went towards different genres, and those things were left behind. So when it comes to Konami, I just don't have much faith. But this is a time where some of those things could work if they actually put the time and resources into them.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, the Japanese, like, yeah, I know we're going to transition here to another subject, but I do think that there's something that to be said about some of these Japanese companies that stuck it out, and like, thankfully they were big enough to wade through, muddy waters and come out the other side, all the better for it. And Square Enix is another one of these companies that I think just at some point, they had a whole bunch of games that they were developing, and they released a slew of them all at once. And some of them are to various degrees of quality. But what I see them doing is like, okay, we're going to invest a lot into, Dragon Quest, or is it Dragon Warrior here now? I can't remember. Dragon Warrior, which is our like traditional turn-based, probably will never change the format. And then we're gonna continue to invest a lot of money in Final Fantasy, which always changes. And then we're gonna have this thing on the side, Octopath Traveler, which is like kind of newish, 2D-ish, but is cool for those that remember us. There's all of that speaks to like who they are and what people I think remember most for them. Same thing with Capcom. It's like Capcom's always going to be known. Whatever else they do, they're always going to be known as like that fighting game company. Mm-hmm. They produced, Marvel vs. Capcom. They produced Darkstalkers. They produced Street Fighter. It's like, hey, like this is the house that, the fighting game was built upon, and the survival horror was built upon. So Konami, like now they don't really have much of an identity at this point, except Metal Gear. And so we'll see.
There's been so many games to come out since Konami came out with a big franchise. And since they put out a great game in those franchises, like that, there's been so many new franchises that have come that have taken their place. God of War being, I think, probably the biggest one. But it's just it's sad for a company that defined so much. Like how many of us remember when Mantis suddenly starts talking about, oh, I see you've played Castlevania, and you're like, wait, hold on, yes, I have. How do you know? Like, those are the kinds of innovative things that somebody back then was doing, and then Hideo Kojima, and then they just didn't do anything. They didn't do anything.
And and it's they just didn't seem to care about it, or maybe they didn't think they needed it. So we'll see. We're both kind of keeping a watchful eye on that. Speaking of, go ahead.
One more thing before.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
With Capcom can make games that are Capcom versus something, and you care enough about the Capcom characters that you're playing,
right?
And that says something. If you can make a game like Capcom versus Marvel, Capcom versus Tatsunoko, like there's just so many Capcom versus games that actually care about. And a lot of the times the character, like if it's not Capcom versus Marvel, if it's Capcom versus someone else, like for us here in the West, like I have no idea who these characters are. Like Capcom versus SNK, and I'm like, yeah, I know that SNK is a fighting company, and I think I've heard of this game, but it's like, like we're playing for the Capcom characters. That says something about their brand identity that they've made through making games.
Yeah,
not just promoting their one thing and destroying it, but actually getting something out into the cultural consciousness that stays there.
Well, it probably says something that more young kids know Solid Snake through Super Smash Brothers than the actual Metal Gear games.
And like not to beat the Konami Dead Horse or the Metal Gear Dead Horse, but I hated playing as Big Boss instead of Solid Snake. Like I think the first Metal Gear Solid game is a masterpiece. I think it is a masterpiece, and I think it has been diminishing returns ever since on that franchise.
Well noted. I actually loved it. I hated playing as Raiden in Metal Gear 2.
I did not hate it as much as most people because that game is still really good and it didn't deviate enough, like so much from the format that I got mad at it. But I did just want to go back to playing as Solid Snake. That's for
So
sure.
well, I'll leave it with this. I am excited. This is one thing that I think they're doing well. They're releasing the Metal Gear games again, but for modern consoles, which is one thing that they really screwed up because it's really hard to get all of those games. So now that they're coming out with like we're coming out with our volume 1 and 2. I will definitely be getting those and replaying them. And then I'll be curious to see what my impressions are now, and having been 10, 15 years removed from some of these games.
And the Metal Gear Solid remake, I think was the GameCube. Like that kind of remake where it's pretty much literally just a graphical upgrade. I could see the point of that for games from PlayStation 2 era and before. And so if they are probably going to use that game as the model and not the original PlayStation version, but which maybe they do. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about it. I mean, I'm not going to be pissed off because there is probably a young person out there that looks at the PlayStation graphics and says like, I can't even discern what these things are just because they didn't grow up with it.
For sure. Well, I do want to transition now into kind of, I'll call it our main topic, even though we spent a lot of time on this, which is great. But I want to talk about something that's been going on. This has actually been, I think we're coming up on a year since Microsoft first announced that they were going to be trying to acquire Activision Blizzard. Is that it? Activision Blizzard, right? Which owns, if you don't know, for some reason, Activision owns Call of Duty. Blizzard has, everything from Blizzard, World of Warcraft, Diablo, which is, huge right now. Again, all of those properties, it's massive. And the price tag on that, $69 billion to acquire that. So I want to talk about this on a few different levels. Microsoft, I'll give you my initial impressions, and then maybe we can look at it from a couple different angles. Right now, they're tied up in litigation. The FTC has basically blocked them from being able to do this. With Sony being pretty heavily involved in trying to assure that this doesn't go through, basically based on like, hey, this isn't fair. This makes them more of a monopoly, just to kind of buy up these massive companies, which Xbox has already done with several companies. So part of the reason, the Call of Duty being one of the biggest ones, is that PlayStation sees residuals from that doing basically nothing. They don't develop it, they don't publish it, they just get money. And I think the amount of revenue that I heard was somewhere in the neighborhood of like $1.5 billion a year every time one comes out, which is basically free money. So of course they don't want to lose that. That's one of the first excuses, was like, hey, we don't want Call of Duty to become exclusive for Xbox, which Xbox is saying, well, they wouldn't do that. There's been a lot of back and forth. Just before my initial impression, right? Like, I'm not an Xbox owner currently. I have owned Xbox. I have a PC, so I kind of feel like I have most of what Xbox has to offer. But on an initial surface, I hate this. And I've been asking myself, do I hate this because it's Microsoft, or do I just hate the idea of companies buying up other companies? Because there is a side of me that kind of wants Sony to just buy Square Enix, even though I don't think that would probably be good in the long run. Like, there's something about being like independent. But the reason I want that is because I know Sony as a company invests heavily into making their games and their first person or their first and second party games really high quality. And I want to see like Sony's assets and talent go into a property like Final Fantasy to make it like as good as it could possibly be. That's my motivation behind that. Where I feel like Xbox just wants to buy stuff. and they just want to take stuff away, and they haven't proven that they can really develop and make games that are on that level. We've had this conversation before. They have good games, but they've relatively done a poor job in the last 2 generations. And what this feels is desperate. And Microsoft has the bank account to just be able to be like, well, I'll just buy this. I'll just buy this. And I don't like that practice of like, you know, waiting for something to grow to a certain size and then taking it away. Like I don't have any respect for that. There's no like, hey, we worked with these guys forever. Like we developed these things together. Yeah, we just want to now. There's none of that. So I don't know what your initial impressions are of it, but I do want to say that I hate it, and I'm kind of glad that it's stuck in litigation. But ultimately, I'm not sure how this is all going to play out, except that it just makes me think like this is just, as somebody who pays attention to the industry, it's like this just feels like a desperate move for Xbox. And I think that even if this does go through, I don't know that saves them. They'll just continue to and funnel money into this stuff. And from a lot of those guys that have been like in the know and a lot of the higher ups, it doesn't even seem like they already know that they've lost and that they don't have a chance of catching up. So I'm confused as to why they're doing all this. What are kind of when you hear about the story or you think about it, what are just some of your raw feelings about it?
Oh, it's inevitable. It's an example of the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, that the idea that 20% of like a business, say, is going to make 80% of the profit.
Sure.
Right. So like in this case, the people who have the money and are making the most money are going to continue to make money, and they're going to continue to get rich. So let's say it doesn't go through, but Activision Blizzard, they're like, hey, for the shareholders, their ethic that they are trying to uphold is not to the consumer of video games, it's to the shareholders. And
Right.
what's most profitable is making the most money.
Right.
And people don't like that, but that is actually because it affects our video games, and we get crappy video games, and we get practices we don't like from people like the head of, whatever the guy's name is, the head of Activision that everybody always memes. But the reality is that protects the economy in general a lot of the time. It does, but it can make for bad consumer practices, and so people don't like it. But the reality is, if Activision decides, hey, Microsoft wants to buy Call of Duty, and they're going to give us, however many billions of dollars, which would hypothetically be totally worth it to buy this franchise from us, not just to buy the company, but to buy the franchise, we wouldn't be talking about this. The only reason that it's even possibly not going to happen is because of the idea of unfair competition and, basically monopoly rules and things like that. That Microsoft's going to be too big, and there's not going to be that freedom. And that's the only reason it's going to happen, that it might not happen. Not because it wouldn't be what's best for Activision Blizzard and their shareholders, not because it wouldn't be what's best for Xbox and their shareholders, or for Microsoft and their shareholders, but because of the monopoly rules. And it's like, that's fine. I think that there are some good aspects of antitrust, anti-monopoly legislation, and I think there are some bad things. But the reality is that Activision is a company that puts out Call of Duty, and they make billions of dollars from it. Residual income, all of the things that we have been talking about on this podcast, this show, for literally years now, is represented in Activision, and to some degree, even though it pains me to say, Blizzard, the taking advantage of people's propensity to sin by making them addicted to essentially gambling mechanics, or to taking advantage of people in that way. The ideas of season passes, of not making a great game, but making a game that will be played for a long time, playing to people's addictive personalities. It's like all of those things are there, and it's like I don't care what happens to Activision Blizzard. Ultimately, I don't care. I have not bought a new Blizzard product in years, even though I was tempted recently because they had a big sale to buy the newest World of Warcraft expansion. Like I did not do it because I don't have the time to play the game. And there is this idea that I think we still have of this 90s. So a lot of us have this 90s idea of like the console wars, and especially as it got into the PlayStation and Xbox era, and then Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, we didn't see third-party exclusives like we did prior to that. And we got used to this idea of, well, if I'm going to play Call of Duty, I'm going to play it on the console I already have. Whereas like that was not the case in 1992. The video game capabilities of the Sega Genesis were not capable of playing the games and making the types of games that the Super Nintendo was. The PlayStation was not capable of the kinds of games that were on the Nintendo 64, and the Nintendo 64, frankly, was not capable of the games that were on the PlayStation. They were so different. And now there's so much parity where like you're talking about not will it be able to run this game? It's like, how many frames per second? Will it run slightly better? Will it look slightly better based on my preferences? That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about everything being run on basically a PC, but at a lower cost point. And so for me, like, it doesn't really matter to me what happens to these companies. The only thing that slightly bothers me is the idea that we've seen what happens when these top companies buy other companies. The franchises die. They stop making games. It happened when EA bought things. It happened when Activision bought things. And when Xbox buys things, when Sony buys things, they're buying them for like a lot of time, not only for those big, huge franchises like Call of Duty, Diablo, Warcraft, or if say Sony bought Square Enix, they're not buying it for Chrono Cross.
Sure.
They're not going to put out a new Chrono game. I mean, Square Enix isn't even doing that. Like they're not going to care about Dragon Quest to the same degree. Probably they're not going to care about whatever smaller things that you would want to see from Square Enix, but they will care about Final Fantasy. They will care about the big name things, and that is inevitably what happens. I mean, what games does EA even put out now? We're talking about mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah, they have multiple divisions now. I mean, besides all the sports games that we're familiar with, they have another division that's starting to put out stuff that's like first-person shooters and things like that. But nothing that the fact that I can't just summon one up to my brain tells you kind of a lot.
To rack our brains to think about what I mean at one time, and I mean, a company that's made $7.42 billion in revenue in 2023. And we're having to rack our brains to try to find out what games they've put out. Yeah. Because in reality, they've bought everything. They bought so many companies that we put out games that we absolutely loved, and they've done nothing. They've done nothing with them. And that's what would happen with these acquisitions. Ultimately, like it would be, I think, a good thing that Microsoft doesn't get Activision Blizzard, because who's to say that anything would ever even come out? That it would come out with the same clip that it's coming out now. We have they're buying so many things. It's like something's going to get lost in the shuffle. And it's like you already bought these other companies that you wanted to make games, and it's like then the priority switches to Blizzard.
Right. I appreciate the thoughts, because there are what you said about the shareholders, I think is true. As somebody who's not a shareholder, I can only come at it from my perspective, which is, a guy that loves games, right?
Mhm.
And there's a part of this stuff that I'm privy to, being that I'm somebody who pays attention to these things to a degree. And it's like, well, I feel like Xbox knows it's losing. They're trying to stay afloat. This is the best way they can stay afloat, is to continue to just buy up properties and make money that way. Clearly, and there's also like a weird. I was listening to Sacred Symbols, which if you really want to get into it from like a granular uh, aspect, the latest episode of Sacred Symbols was really good. They talked about it for like an hour, but the thinking about, okay, what they're thinking about, like, Microsoft has done a good job of this, of separating, like they've put themselves into the perspective, I think, in the minds of some people, I was like, we're the little guy, which is hilarious
Yeah.
because it's Microsoft and they could probably
There is no little guy.
buy the
There is
planet.
no little guy. It's 20%, 80%. It's 1%,
Yeah,
99%.
there's no little guy in general. I mean, but in terms of that, like, they've managed to distance themselves from the overall like mothership of Microsoft, which could probably buy, Nintendo and Sony, multiple times over if they wanted to. But Sony's been the dominant, force in the gaming industry for the last 2 generations at least. And then Nintendo's always just kind of like the darling, like they're just happy in their own lane. So Microsoft doesn't have, to your point, because hardware wise, things aren't all that different. Microsoft doesn't really have much of a space to carve itself out uniquely. Their one big thing, and this is kind of the other aspect of this, and which I don't think is, and I don't think is good for companies that they're looking at buying, is the whole Game Pass situation. Game Pass is good for the consumer to some degree. It's definitely good for the consumer who doesn't have a lot of money. Like if I'm a teenager or I'm a kid, and that's great. But as an adult who does have limited time, I don't even have time to play all these games. Like,
Yeah,
how could I even how could I even carve out enough time?
right.
And I want to, so I spend my money like purposefully and hopefully wisely on the things that I feel like I'm going to really get the most out of. And that endears me to them and to that brand. But what's happening is that Microsoft is taking all of their biggest properties and dumping them on Game Pass, which is like $10 a month or something like that. It's not profitable for them, not at all. And I don't think ultimately for the companies that they're acquiring. I think if you would ask, and again, this is kind of delved into deeply more on Sacred Symbols, but there's been multiple reports of these companies. They don't like putting their stuff, like bigger companies do not like having their games on Game Pass. They do not like the fact that they are exclusive. They don't like. Are you telling me Bethesda doesn't want to be on PS5? Like that Starfield doesn't want to be on PS5? Are you kidding me? Like with the PlayStation 5 installed base, of course they do, because they see residuals for that on their end. So there's an aspect of that. Now you could argue that Sony does the same thing, and certainly they do to a degree. Final Fantasy 16 is PlayStation exclusive at least for a year. But I think you could make at least you could make an argument that Final Fantasy and Japanese games in general have never sold well on the Xbox relative to their competition, and that's always been the case, always. So maybe you lose a little bit of that, but it's not the same as like having an install base like Call of Duty, which is huge on basically everything, and then threatening to take that away from them, even though that's probably not what they'll do in the long run. And to your point, I do worry about some of these other lesser brands getting gobbled up. I don't think I've seen an example yet of like Microsoft having bought a company and then been like, and here's like a way better version of this, or here's the next. Like, we'll go back to Red Fail, which was like Arcane's like, that was your chance and you screwed it up. And let's go back to Fallout 76. You screwed that up. So now Starfield really has to hit. And
Right.
I think it looks good, but it's just one of those things that's like, that's always going to be in the back of my mind, is like of what Microsoft does to these franchises.
Well, and I don't. So you said what Microsoft does to these franchises. It's what all of these big corporations do to these franchises. It's like, especially in today's day and age, the way that the video game industry has gone, the future is not physical media. It's not going to GameStop. It's not going certainly not going to Software Etc. or EB Games or like any of Electronic Boutique. That's what EB stands for. Like the like going and buying those games. Like eventually, I would say within probably, if I'm being generous, 20 years, but probably 10, you're going to continue to see physical media just go away. Those sections of stores have shrunk. And what now is in front of people is digital only. Now, that is something that happened in the PC industry 10 years ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah, 10, 15 years ago.
Since like Steam.
Yeah, I mean, basically,
Half-Life
whenever
2.
Steam was founded, is basically the end,
Yeah.
and that will happen. And at that point, games will be the game industry will have changed considerably. Now, I think there will still be some physical media. I could see Nintendo staying with it. Because if they're trying to do a handheld device, they want to give people the option of being able to just put the game in, not have to download it, do all those things. That is something to consider, but for how long that'll last, I don't know. But right now, speaking about Game Pass, is they want to get to the point where they have the Netflix of video games. They want that. They do not care ultimately about, I think, making individually great games. What they want is to have the selling point being, I only have to pay $10 a month. Because when I was a kid, I did not have video games. But when I was a young adult, I had video games. And I did not buy $60 video games every year. I bought Red Dead Redemption for $60, but other than that, like I'm struggling to remember a game that I even bought new on the Xbox 360. Like most of what I bought was pre-owned because that was cheaper. And $60 was a lot then. It continues to be a lot. And $10 a month or whatever Game Pass costs. It's like, well, I can manage that. And so you get people into paying $120 every year, buying 2 brand new games a year. And then, well, it's like, prices have raised. It went up $1 or $2. Oh, it's fine. It's the same thing with Netflix and Hulu and all these other things. And that's what they want. And so of course they're going to try to obtain more games for Game Pass. And however, something like Call of Duty, they have to look at the actual how much money would we make if we had Call of Duty on just Xbox? Like, is Call of Duty so important that it will sell Xbox consoles? It's like, I don't know that any video game nowadays is so important as to sell the console to somebody who doesn't have it already. Like, does that make sense?
Call of Duty's huge though. Like that's I think if I really do, because like if Call of Duty was on Xbox exclusively, 100%, I think there would be quite a bit of people.
I'm not connected to the Call of Duty community, so I don't know. I have not played a Call of Duty game since Call of Duty Modern Warfare.
It's like Fortnite. It's like I don't know anybody in my circle that plays Fortnite. No one, but it's the biggest game in the world. The same thing with Minecraft and Call of Duty's not there.
It's like they have to look at that and they have to say, hey, is it going to sell our console to people that don't have it because they so want to play Call of Duty? And it's possible that it might, but it's also possible that, hey, we will make more money by keeping it available for everyone.
That's more likely.
And that's what I think would happen. Yeah. I think that when Elder Scrolls, whatever the next one, 6, I guess, or 7?
6, yeah.
Whatever it's going to be.
I can't remember.
when that inevitably comes out, I don't think it's going to be exclusive to Xbox and PC. I don't. And the reason why I think that is because Minecraft, which is a huge game, has made them billions of dollars, continues to make them money as each subsequent generation of the age group that loves Minecraft gets to that point, they start playing Minecraft. Like my niece started playing Minecraft. She's like 12 or something. She started playing it and got into it just as much as the previous generation, just as much as my brother, who's now like in his late 20s, got into it. It's one of those evergreen things, and they've continued to make money by putting it on other consoles, and I think other platforms. And it's like, so they're not completely stupid about how they're going to do money. They have to serve their masters, which is Microsoft, which is shareholders, which is making money. And the thing for me that I think, like I said before, is a bigger deal to me, because I don't Final Fantasy, like I haven't played a Final Fantasy game since Final Fantasy, like a bunch of it, like can through most of the story or through the whole game since Final Fantasy 9. So I've played some of Final Fantasy 10, and I hope to beat it someday. I hope to go back and play some more of it. But to me, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm not going to go race out and buy a PlayStation. But what I would hate to see is things that I am interested in. Like, oh, they've made a Chrono game, and it is not just a modern game like the Final Fantasy games are, but it is more of a throwback to some older things, or it's really cool and everybody should go and play it. And then I'm like, oh man, I gotta go buy a PlayStation. So that's where I do see that argument. It's like, well, I guess I'm not going to play it because I'm not going to shell out, whatever, $500, $400 for for another console when I already have something. But I don't know. It is a conundrum.
I do want to push back a little bit on what you said about how like all companies buy things and then like lose. Well, I think I was a while ago you said it, so I'm put a pin in my mind. I think Sony's different. Sony bought Insomniac. Insomniac's now a first-person developer. We wouldn't have Spider-Man if they didn't do that. The last game that they made that was a third-party game was Sunset Overdrive for Xbox, which I understand is a good game. I never played it, but there is a difference between what Sony has done and what Xbox has done just in their track record. And I think, again, coming at it from the gamer perspective, I want to see the best games possible. There is a weird I think if we bring this back down to just like a gamer and a gamer community level, I think there's a weird, this goes into like the console war and the fanboy whole thing, which we should probably do an episode on sometime, but there's definitely a lot of people that are rooting for Xbox to be able to do this, but I don't understand why, because I just don't honestly feel at the end of the day it's going to serve the consumers. And my only thought is that the feeling behind that is that they want the same kind of competition that we had in the PS3, Xbox 360 era, which I honestly think we all do, because that's when the best stuff happens. Mm-hmm. But Microsoft is going about achieving that the wrong way. Like, you're not going to get the PlayStation fanboys. You're not going to get a me or guys that want those kinds of experiences. You're not going to get me over there until you show me something that you guys have made that is on that level. And again, that's not saying that everything that they do is bad. It's like, if PlayStation wanted to, let's say it was just PlayStation and Nintendo, PlayStation, as cool as Crash Bandicoot is or whatever, they're never going to be like, you're never going to have a Mario and a Zelda and a Metroid. And so they either have to figure out, like, Sony did enough of its own thing to be able to carve its own space and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to make games for grownups. That's kind of what they just decided to do. And there's a place for Nintendo, and Xbox came along, and what they really innovated on was like, cool. The 360 was great for community. Like their Xbox Live service at the 360 era was way better than PlayStation's. The marketplace was way better. But once Sony kind of caught up there, especially in the PS4 era. They didn't really do much to differentiate themselves, and they haven't created enough internally. They have a chance with like Fable. They have a chance with the new Hell whatever Scape. It's not Hellscape, but so there are some games that I saw at their showcase that I was like, wow, this is cool. This looks good. So I think there's that, but I just worry about the industry as a whole, and this isn't just about the acquisition, though that's what we're talking about. Like the industry as a whole is in a weird spot, because you said it earlier, in 10 years, this whole thing could look totally different. Maybe we're just looking at free to play, pay to win, whatever kind of games. And our era is a bygone era. So I won't, and I think what Xbox is doing is leading more towards that and pushing that forward. And I don't like where that's going. So,
right.
Yeah.
No, and just to clarify, it's not that they don't make any games. It's that they buy these companies that have a big history or a big backlog and catalog of games that people want to see. And instead of putting resources and money into the second tier games, third tier games, they are focusing on those big money makers. They're not buying Activision for whatever little game we liked a few years ago. They're buying it for Call of Duty. They're buying it for World of Warcraft, and they're buying it for Diablo Immortal. Right. They are buying it for the things that are predatory. Yeah. World of Warcraft, not as much, but especially Diablo Immortal. I almost did the middle finger, but that might be that might actually be appropriate for Diablo Immortal. But especially Diablo Immortal, which is a pay to win, a like multiple in-game currency. The currency is not matching up, having leftover currencies when you use them, like funneling people to paying more money, and all of these tricks that we as the conscientious video gamer criticize as we pump more money into the games. Like that's why they're buying it. And so Activision Blizzard, I don't care if they buy them. I don't want them to buy them. I don't care. But inevitably, the companies will continue, the biggest companies, I think, will continue to acquire things. They will continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And they will push their products like they are. They're going to push whatever makes them the most money, we'll say.
Yeah.
And you said it, Insomniac Games, they let them make games. Yeah, they're definitely letting them make games. But they're not comparable, I think, to something like this other acquisition. And just to push back a little bit on what you said, they made Spyro, they made Ratchet and Clank, and other than that, they're not like some known for their games. Like I don't think anybody outside of maybe some diehard Spyro fan could even really know that it was Insomniac that made them.
Oh no, I mean I agree, and I mean honestly, I had forgotten that Activision owned Call of Duty. I think there is a difference there, and I guess what I'm getting at is that I think Sony's method of acquiring companies and their history of acquiring.
But when we compare like to like, so I just want to push back on this. There is no equivalent from Sony's perspective, which could be good or bad, of acquiring something like ZeniMax or Activision Blizzard. There's no comparison.
Oh, 100%.
The comparison with Insomniac should be made to something like Obsidian or In Exile or any of those other companies that they did acquire who are now putting out games. So like,
but that's kind of to my point.
No, I know, but I just want to make sure that we don't, because it was still a bad comparison to compare Insomniac to this acquisition, but it's not in Microsoft's favor for that. But I also don't think that if Sony was in the same position, they wouldn't be doing it. Like there's some sort of altruistic like company. No, they want to make the most money and they want to continue to make money in those. So it's not. It has to do with their internal practices and all of these things that we've discussed, I think now for like a couple of weeks.
It comes to strategy though. Like Sony doesn't have to do anything. Like they're already winning. Like the PlayStation is the biggest brand. They don't have to do anything. Microsoft does. And their strategy reeks of desperation. Whereas Sony's strategy is to like if they're going to acquire something, they're going to invest in it because I know it's all about money. Like I think that's presume. It's not altruistic in the sense like, oh, they care about me, the gamer, but it is a sense in which like we know where our lane is and we know why we're successful. And we know that like when we invest in these properties and we have these big games, like that goes to the reason why people want to buy consoles and everything else. Whereas I think Microsoft's strategy is just to buy, but I don't think that really helps them. Maybe it does. It's maybe a stopgap for the shareholders if you want to make that argument, but it doesn't help them and it doesn't help the industry and it doesn't help the gamers that are like want a reason to buy an Xbox, get one. So I just find it as like, okay, well, we're just doing this to meet a financial need. That's just a stupid strategy in my opinion. So unless I'm a shareholder, but we have to see how that shakes out. So that's kind of my point is like, Sony is strategic and like we know what we want to do with this, and this speaks to our culture. This speaks to what we're trying to portray PlayStation as a brand and an identity. And now now everybody knows Insomniac because you gave them Spider-Man, which was huge outside of which was huge outside of PlayStation, right? Like nobody I don't know if anybody remembers the Activision Spider-Man games from like the PS2 era, but then you take a brand that's already massive and you add like now what is first party under the wing of Sony development and make it into just like a masterpiece of a game, which in many ways it is. Whereas like Microsoft buys Bethesda and who knows what influence they have on it at all. From what I understand, kind of very little. So I don't know. I don't know how they're going to continue to try to buy and manage and like
and
how these games gestate.
We don't know if this merger is even going to go through. We don't know what they'll do with it. We don't know anything about it really, other like what the future will hold. But I don't think, the reality is that Microsoft is a far bigger company than Sony, Sony corporate. And the fact that Microsoft has stuck with the Xbox this entire time and has gone through the ups and downs of it and continues to push forward and continue to do it is actually, I think pretty interesting considering how many companies tried and failed to continue to make consoles, to continue to be a big dominant force. Yeah. And the acquisition in general, just speaking about the Activision Blizzard acquisition, to me does not affect me. I don't care. I don't care if Sony has Call of Duty. I don't care if Xbox has Call of Duty. Blizzard's not going to put out the Warcraft RPG, single player RPG that I've wanted for like 15 years. They're not going to do it. They're not going to put out a great new franchise that isn't based upon making the most money possible from somebody. Activision Blizzard is a compromised company that represents everything that I hate about the modern video game industry. As far as Xbox buying them, maybe some of those things would go away, but probably not because they're buying them for their revenue. They're buying them for how much money they can generate. And those things are generated by bad practices. Call of Duty is a crap franchise that predates on people. That is what the entirety of Blizzard is basically built upon nowadays, to a lesser degree or more, depending on where you count Diablo Immortal. And so I'm glad that Sony is making its way without, at least its first party games without doing that kind of stuff. I hope Xbox does that as well, although I have my doubts that anybody will maintain that for long. So my final thing on the acquisitions and mergers and all of those things is that it is inevitable. It is inevitable. Disney will own Lucasfilm. A big video game company will own a lot of the franchises that people currently like. They'll run them into the ground. And then eventually, unless they sign some sort of exclusivity contract for the NFL, to get those rights and maintain those rights forever, which don't exist for something like Call of Duty. There's no exclusivity contracts can be signed for first person multiplayer season pass games. Those can be made by anybody, basically. My point is, something else will rise in its place. If Call of Duty goes to Microsoft and it fails, people don't go buy Microsoft consoles. They stick with their PlayStation console to play Fortnite or whatever. Something else will come and take Call of Duty's place, and it'll all be for naught. It doesn't, like, ultimately a bloodstain will rise in the place of the dead Castlevania.
We'll see. You know, I think some of these things are more evergreen than that. I mean, I don't want to pontificate too much longer because we're well over an hour, but I do think I'll say just on the Call of Duty thing there, to me, the one thing that would make, they're not going to do this, but if Xbox did have Call of Duty as an exclusive, I would be excited to see Sony try to do something to compete with it and make something on their own, whether that's Call of Duty or whether that's like, you know, they've abandoned the Killzone franchise, which I don't know why, because Guerrilla is a great studio. So I would love to see some of those things rise from the ashes, but yeah, well, it'll be interesting. We covered a lot of ground here, and some of these things I think we can continue to talk about. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an ongoing conversation, right? Like, we're going to find out at some point how this all shapes out, and then we'll revisit this and kind of keep ourselves updated on the topic, because I think it's going to continue to be relative, and depending on how this falls, this could really, you know, if this does go through, I could see Sony pushing back and then like, well, we're going to buy this, and this. And I don't know if that's a great thing either, but that's just all hypothesis right now.
For an optimistic point, from an optimistic point of view, which I don't often have, the thing that we can definitively say about video games is that there's a huge gap between crappy games and good games. And crappy games do not sell. They don't last. They go away the vast majority of the time. And it is the good games or great games that become popular, that sell, whether it's innovative gameplay or the story's not as important. The innovative gameplay of video games will continue, and there will be games to play in the future. It just might not be our franchises that we like. And I think, going back to the beginning of the podcast, ultimately things move on. We move on from Konami. Like, the people who really loved Silent Hill 2, and they drew pictures of Pyramid Head, or like, those types of individuals, they're really longing for a Silent Hills game. But the vast majority of people aren't. And that's okay. It's okay for these franchises to die, because SOCOM used to be the game that everybody in my high school was playing. Does anybody even remember SOCOM today? Call of Duty versus Medal of Honor, like, there's something else will come, and it will be better, and people will move on, and then the whole argument will start over again, I think.
Yeah. Well, definitely a good discussion. Thanks for giving your thoughts on it. I think, I think I want to continue to analyze this. Maybe when we get past, maybe we'll bring in a third person in and see, we can kind of round robin this even more. But all right. Well, I think it's a good time to end the show. So I think the new slogan should be, buy the companies the way you want to buy them.
Yeah.
And,
exactly. There we go.
But tell us a little bit about your other,
the way you want to please them.
Well, thanks, Daniel, for joining me. I know you have another podcast. Tell people where they can find it if they want to, or your other channel, rather.
Yeah, Fly Fox Pro on YouTube and on various social media platforms. You can follow me there, and you can see my sporadically posted live streams, podcasts, and other various content.
Cool. Well, take us home.
Play the games the way you want to play them.
Till next time, we'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching or listening, whatever. I'll come up with a better tagline. See ya. Bye.